Okay, today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Yud Zayin. We are going to finish the first parak, so I want to already in advance congratulate you all for finishing the first chapter. This was a real first chapter to be proud of finishing, not a simple task. For all those who are struggling with understanding Yevamot, I hope that you're going to see today that as we go on and continue and go more in depth, right? The first Mishnah was very overwhelming. It had a lot of cases, and as I told you, it's like a movie unfolding, and as you get into things are going to be much more clear, and we're going to learn cases much more in depth, and it should be getting a little bit easier as we go on. So that's the first thing I want to say. Gefet's going to go up later today, which is about the last number of dapim that we've discussed, the Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel thing, and more of a bit of a comparison, how you compare a sugya hilchatit to a halachic sugya to in a gadic sugya, and some interesting differences based on some Tosfots. So it should go up sometime later today. Okay. Today's daf is some dedications. Today's daf is sponsored by Randy Schuster in honor of Sharona Schuster for finishing her first parak of Yevamot. As I said, a big congratulations. Today's daf is sponsored by Ellen Golub and Stephen Sass in memory of Leo Golub, Aryeh Le Ben Eliyahu and Masi on his 8th year at site. He was a native Yiddish speaker who loved the Jewish people, and despite a streak of atheism, insisted that his only daughter have an excellent Jewish education. He devoted his life to building a curious, creative, and loving Jewish family, and is remembered joyfully by 4 grandchildren and 8 grandchildren. He zichrona levracha. Okay, we're going to get started. We were in the middle of this fascinating topic about the concern that when we come in contact with Gentiles and possibly end up in a relationship with them and marry them, maybe the marriage is a valid marriage. Why would it be? Marriage with a Gentile is not considered marriage. But maybe there's a concern that he came from one of the 10 lost tribes. And therefore, maybe we would call this Safek Kiddushin, which means the woman is a Safek Eshet Ish. Normally, if you marry a Gentile, it's not actually considered a wedding. According to Jewish law, you're not actually a married woman. But if there's a concern that the person came from one of the 10 lost tribes, then we have to be concerned. So we ended with a list of all these people, right? We had a bit of a distinction between whether the person came out from the city or the person's actually in the city, where there we're going to say 50-50 chance that they're Jews, rather than if it's one person taken out of a group of many people, then we would say, oh, well, it just goes by percentages and the majority of the people there are Gentiles. You have to remember, whether the 10 tribes, they came from the Assyrian Galut, exile, which was before the destruction of the temple. And there was the Shomron, right? The Jewish kingdom, the Yisrael. There was Yisrael and Yehuda, was in Shomron, and they took all the people there and they moved everybody around. And that was the pasuk we quoted before at the end of yesterday's daf about all these places. And then they went into what are the actual locations, which didn't really help us so much. We ended on the second line of Yud Zayin, which was, there was Nihar v'chavroteh, or some people say it's Chandan v'chavroteh, chavroteh, Amam, what are chavroteh, like the places outside that city, nearby. Amar Shmuel, Kirach, Mushfei, Chidki, v'Dumkia. Okay, again, this doesn't really help us, but it's names of different places. You can look in the Korah and they kind of put these places on the map for you. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Besides that we're worried, Safek Kiddushin, which is what Rav Asi said, Rabbi Yochanan comes and says, V'chulan lifsol. And all of these people are disqualified. Okay, Rashi says, what does it mean they're disqualified, right? Besides, and we discussed this yesterday, the concern is that since they went and were living among non-Jews, they weren't really keeping laws of Torah, in which case they might have married relatives of theirs. Now, there's 2 reasons why they might have married relatives. Number one is maybe they don't care about Jewish law and they married Jewish relatives because they didn't care. Number 2, the Jews were crazy about keeping yichus books. Who's related to who came from what family. They weren't very careful because they weren't living in a Jewish community. So they might not have even known that people were related to them. So they might have ended up accidentally marrying, right? Maybe not intentionally, but what's the difference? Their kids are mamzerim. So he basically says they're all lipsol. I believe it's here that some people say maybe it's just psula kihuna. Okay, there might be some commentaries. Rashi clearly says it's a mamzer problem. Otherwise, you could say maybe it's psula kihuna because, for example, one who engages in a relationship with a Gentile is going to have a child who can't marry a Kohen. So anyway, I believe that's the case. Don't quote me on it. Someone should check that out to make sure that's true. But in any case, they're concerned with these people because they were Jews. Now we're going to have 2 versions of Shmuel's reaction. In the end, the gist of Shmuel is going to be the same. He wants to get rid of this entire thing. First of all, you have to imagine, right? This could create a huge problem, right? Because first of all, this means, going back to what we saw yesterday, you can't accept converts from these people, right? So this creates a huge problem within the Jewish community. Someone comes from one of those cities and now, wants to convert in, let's say they're not sure they're Jewish or they just want to convert in any case, they can't convert. What I was thinking about nowadays, there's people who are Suffolk Jews, they claim they're from the 10 tribes and they say we're Jewish. According to this, you wouldn't be able to accept them if they're Jewish because there's a concern for mamzerim. That would create a huge problem, okay? So that's a serious issue. So in general, there's a lot of ramifications from these sugyot to things that are going on nowadays with all sorts of people that are living in Israel that aren't considered Jews. And there's many people ignore the problem, right? There's at least 450,000 people who are not halachically Jewish who are living in the state of Israel and, are somewhat Jewish, but not halachically Jewish. And that creates a huge problem. As you see here, same thing. We don't know who to marry. We don't, right? It's a big problem. And there are people trying to resolve these issues, right? My husband included. But that's a really big, important thing. So that was Shmuel. Shmuel said, we've got to resolve this issue. So the first answer he gives, it's a very interesting one. Amarli, so Kiamarita Kamei de Shmuel, when he heard this, what Ravasi said, and maybe also what Rabbi Yochanan said, Amarli, okay, when I told this to him, okay, this is Rabbi Yehuda, said in the name of Ravasi. And then Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, when I told, Ravasi said, it must have been Ravasi and not Rabbi Yochanan because it's Rabbi Yehuda. When I told it to Shmuel, he said to me, Bincha haba min Yisraeli karoi bincha, ve'ein bincha haba min ha'oved kochavim karoi bincha ela bina. This is, in much simpler words, Jews go by the mother, right? This is how we determine if someone's Jewish. Here you have it, right? It says, your son who comes from a Yisraelite is called your son. Comes from a female Jew, it's called a son. But if the mother is not Jewish, even though the father is, it's not karoi bincha ela bina, goes by her. So therefore, there's no concern. What are you concerned for? That men from the exile went there, married Gentile women, and now their kids are Suffolk Jews? They're not Suffolk Jews. They're not Jews at all. It all goes by the mother. They're Gentiles, so no problem. Basically, that resolves the issue. What's the problem with what he's saying? He's ignoring 50% of the population, right? To which the Gemara says, Va'ika banot, but what about their women? People went to exile, they went men and women. So why aren't you worried about the female Jews who married Gentiles? Their children will be Jewish. This is a bit of a strange shmamina. I think it's pretty obvious, but anyway, maybe I'm not understanding it properly. But Ravina says, your granddaughter, right? In other words, if you have the daughter's son that comes from an Oved Kochavim is called your son because the daughter is the one who determines, right? Like the assumption is here, the father and mother were Jewish, and then you have a daughter, right? And your granddaughter will be Jewish because it's called by the daughter's name. Not sure what he's adding here. But anyway, let's go back to our topic. So the answer to his question is, why is he not worried about the women? Interesting answer. We learn that the women of that generation all became barren. They couldn't have children. It seems a little odd. What, all women? So the assumption is that when they went to the exile, right, it was a hard trip and they were affected by the trip in a way they all became barren. So none of the Jewish women were able to have children, only the men. And therefore, we're not worried about them being Jews. It's a bit of a, not the greatest answer because it's hard to imagine they all became barren, but that's one possibility, which basically means, right? What do you see here? If there's a halachic will, there's a halachic way, right? Even though his answer is a little bit out there, but when there's a need to find an answer to a big problem, there's ways, right? You could say, theoretically, maybe they all really became barren and maybe there really aren't any Jews there at all. And that's his solution he comes up with. The second reading of Shmuel is even more interesting in my mind. Ikad Amrei. Now, you have to remember, in Judaism, the way the halacha works is if you convert out of Judaism, you're still considered a Jew, okay? No matter what. You can consider yourself whatever you want. Judaism considers you Jewish. So now, what do they say here? This is the second version of the story. Rabbi Yehuda came and told this to Shmuel. Amar li, lo zazu misham ad sh'asum ovdei kochavim gemurim, Shneemar ba'Hashem bagdu ki banim zarim yaladu. He basically determined, he said, we're not moving from here. This is when someone needs to come up with a response and a solution. I am not moving from here until we declare these people non-Jews. In other words, against the basic halacha that they're Jews. Okay, right? The basic halacha is these people, the 10 tribes, they left. They're still Jews, even if they don't practice Judaism anymore. But he quotes a verse to try to support. That's always the best way to support yourself. Quote a verse. That b'Hashem bagdu, they rebelled against God. Ki banim zarim yaladu, because they gave birth to foreign children. What do you see here? The pasuk says their children are not Jewish. So basically, he came and determined. He said, we're going to vote on this and make a takana, right? How they can do that is very interesting because it goes against the basic halacha. But sometimes where there's a real need, you have to just say, look, we're determining that these people, we're taking the liberty, we have the power to do this, determine that these people are not Jewish. And that was how he resolved the issue. So you have this debate among Rav Asi and Rabbi Yochanan on one hand, who by the right, Rabbi Yochanan was in Israel. Rav Asi, I have to check because there's usually Rabbi Asi who's from Israel, but they were trying to kind of say, oh no, they're still Jewish. And came Shmuel and said, no, we have to come up with a solution. This isn't manageable. And he comes up with either one or two different ways of understanding Shmuel's solution. It was clear to everybody that Shmuel came up with a solution. The question is just, what was his solution? And then again, what does this resolve? This resolves, number one, if they were to marry, we don't have to worry that the woman's a suffix ish. And number two, right, if they were to marry Jews. Number two, if someone wants to convert from there, we don't have to worry that they have mamzerim in their lineage. Okay, next part. We're going to still continue along this issue. Yativ Rav Yosef achorei de Rav Kahana, v'yativ Rav Kahana kamei de Rav Yehuda. Okay, he was sitting behind him and he was sitting in front of him. Ve'yativ v'kamar, and he sat and he said, Atidin Yisrael de'avdei Yom HaTov ki charvei Talmud. The Jews are going to make a big celebration when the city of Talmud is destroyed. Why? Because it's a city that's creating all these problems for us. Remember, we saw there was a debate whether we have to treat them as Jews or as suffix Jews, and we can't accept converts from there because maybe they're mamzerim or not. So he said, he probably held that they're treated as Jews who are potentially mamzerim. So it'll be much easier for us once that whole city is destroyed. It's a very strange thing to say. You never really want to wish destruction. I think he's just saying this city is causing us a lot of problems. Okay, it's just a way of saying it. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? It is destroyed already. What do you mean when it gets destroyed? It's destroyed city. Hahi tamod havai. No, you're confusing tamod and tarmod. Okay? He's talking about tarmod, you're talking about tamod. Rav Ashi Amar, hainu tamod. It is actually the same city. It's a doubled city. What does that mean? It's basically like two sister cities or something. Every time one part of the city was destroyed, everybody moved to the other side and settled there. And every time that side of the city was destroyed, they moved to the other side of the city. So yes, it was destroyed, but it became resettled all the time. It was the same people moved from one city to the other. And therefore, the people are still there, whether the city was destroyed or not. The city was never entirely destroyed. Another story. He started asking him questions about the sugya. Amar ma gavra. Wow, what a great guy you are. What a great guy. If it were not that you were from the city of Harpanya, like, sorry, but you have bad lineage, or at least we have to be concerned because you're such a great guy, but you come from this bad place. I'm really sorry. Kasif. Now, what happened to Rav Hamnuni? He got embarrassed and he was looking pretty miserable, right? He's feeling like, this isn't good. Like you're totally humiliating me. Amar le ksaf gulgalta lehecha yahavit. He said, wait a minute, the money of your taxes, where do you pay taxes? Amar le lepumnara. I pay taxes to Pumnara, right? This happens sometimes, right? You're a citizen of one area, right? You pay taxes there. You're not going to pay taxes there. And I was thinking of New York and Florida residents, right? People, as they get older, moves down south to Florida, and then they start putting their more residents there so that they can pay taxes in Florida because it's less expensive to pay taxes there. So he says, where do you pay taxes? That's what determines where you live. And he says, Amar le im kemi Pumnara. Okay, well then I can call you that you're from Pumnara, right? You're a Floridian, you're not a New Yorker, right? You're not as snobby as the New Yorkers are. I came from New York, so it's okay. Anyway, just making a joke. But the point is that that he's saying we can call that you're from Pumnara because you pay taxes there, and therefore I'm sorry about what I said. I don't really mean it. Again, this might be like a way of getting out of it. You see, everyone today is trying to find a way of getting out of some sort of situation, right? That was a sticky situation. Here it was just he embarrassed him. The other was, we have a big problem. Okay, I just want to look for a second at the chat because I see someone wrote, I missed an obvious point. So let me just maybe have them say, among us, we could accidentally marry. Why are we concerned that people living as non-Jews who are really Jews may have mamzerim, right? So the problem is that we're concerned, this is what I said before, just to make it clear. If they're Jews living with non-Jews, there's a concern, the assumption is they're not really practicing Judaism anymore the way we were, right? Because they're not living in any real Jewish community, in which case there's a concern that number one, either they don't care about the laws of arayot and they'll marry their sisters, their mothers, their, all the different arayot, or there's a concern that they don't even keep track of the lineage anymore, and therefore might be marrying someone who's their relative that they have no idea is their relative, because the Jews were crazy about keeping these books of yuchsim books, who's married to who, who's this, who's related, and there they weren't doing that. So those are the concerns. Did that answer your question? Yeah, okay. I want to make sure this is clear. Okay, next. We're almost done here with the section. My harpanya. What is the word harpanya? Where does it come from? So Amar Rabbi Zera, harsha hakol ponimbo. This is where we darshan names, okay? It's a hal, it's a mountain. Maybe it was a city built on a mountain that everyone goes there. What does that mean? Everyone who doesn't have a place, right? Everyone who has a problem with their lineage, they all get dumped in the city. B'matnitatan, in a Braita, they say, Kol she'en makir mishpachto v'shivto nifneh l'sham. Anyone who doesn't know their lineage goes there, because anyone who has messed up lineage can't marry a person with good lineage. So again, it depends how messed up your lineage is, but Safek Mamzer can't marry either. So basically, what they did was they created this, it was a place that they just kind of put everybody there. That's how they darshan the name anyway, whether it's true or not. They're just trying to say this is a dumping ground, basically, for all these people with issues. Amarava vihi amukam mish'ol. Now he says something very deep, no pun intended, but he says this is deeper than the depth, than the Gehenom, basically. Okay, this is the worst of the worst. Why? Shene'emar miyad sha'ol epaden mimavet egalen. The pasuk says you're going to get out of Sha'ol. You're going to get out of death. I'll redeem you. V'ilu psul didhu le'lehu takanta. But someone who has mamzerut on them, there's no way to resolve it. Psule de harpanya mishum psule de meshon, psule de mishon mishum psule de tarmod, psule de tarmod mishum avdei shlomo. Basically, trace it all back to Shlomo. They say, let's just read this in the reverse, right? It was because the avdei Shlomo came and married, right, and took these women away and married them, and then they took these Jewish women. Then that caused the psulim of tarmod, right? Because they took them to Talmud. We saw that the other day. That caused the psulim and meshon, because we know people move from place to place. So then it spread to there, and then it spread from there to Harpanya. And it all is rooted, which is so interesting because it's almost like they're blaming Shlomo. Shlomo himself married Gentile women. So you could see it was really his doing. There's a big critique here, it seems, of Shlomo. He brought these avadim in that ended up taking the women. Behind the Amreinashe, Kaba Rabba Bekaba Zuta, Mingadar va'azil l'sha'ol u'mish'ol l'tarmod u'mitarmod l'mishan u'mishan l'harpanya. This is what people say on the street. It's like a quip that people say. What's a kaba? A kaba is a measuring that measures a kav. A kav is a measurement. So if you have measuring cups, right, you have 1 cup measuring cups, and you have a big one and a small one. What does it mean you have a big one and a small 1 cup measuring cup? It's 1 cup, right? If you have a big one and a small one, it means that you're not very careful about how you measure your 1 cup. One is a bit bigger than a 1 cup, and one is a bit smaller than 1 cup. So that's what it's saying. If you have measuring things that are bigger and smaller, and you're not very careful about things, that's what causes, right, all this stuff. You're going to cause you to go down into the Sha'ol. And from the Sha'ol, right, as if that's the worst, no, then from there to Tarmot, from there to Mesham, from there to Harpanya, and then you're basically stuck there for the rest of your life, right? And it's not only that, it's not just you, it's the future generations, right? It goes down. And this is why their problems are huge, right? And this is why we should really make efforts as best as we can, like Shmuel, to try to resolve them in any way that we can. With that, Hadran la-15 nashim, congratulations for finishing the first chapter. Now, it's interesting that it ends with this issue of mamzerim because it doesn't really have to do with Yevamot, but it really does because, again, Yevamot, it's all, you're on a tricky right? On a tricky line here. If you do it in the right way, so you're fulfilling a mitzvah. If you do it in the wrong way, let's say you're not supposed to do yibum, then it's eshet ach, you're marrying your brother's, right? Your brother's marrying his brother's wife, which is forbidden, and your kids will be mamzerim. So you could see why they're ending with this warning about mamzerim, which is be very careful, right? You have to, let's put it this way, learn Yevamot very well so that you know who to avoid and how to make sure you don't end up with mamzer problems. Okay, let's start the next chapter. With this, we're going to bring up our charts again. Okay, our presentation, right? Just to remind everyone, you can find the link to the presentation if you're listening and you're not watching with the video. So you can find the link to it. Number one, on the Daf post, right? On the website where Yevamot 17, there's a link. The Canva is embedded there. So you can just go through the Canva presentation, or there's a link that says presentation in PDF format. You can click on that and watch it. If you do it in PDF, you should do it in a read format or a presentation format. When it's like in view, you can do view read mode, and then it'll move rather than being like one page after another. And also, if you're listening to the podcast, it's very easy to get to it. You can there's a link in the details of the podcast, although I think Spotify doesn't really do that. It doesn't really work in Spotify, but if you're listening any other way, there should be a link in there to the presentation. There is a link. And there's also further down, you can find a link to the website, and then you can get directly to the website and view it in Canva if you like. So it's pretty easy from there to get to the presentation. Okay, here goes. Here's our presentation. Here's our Mishnah. Going to learn the Mishnah. This is a bit review of things we saw before, which is always good because then you'll get them better. The Mishnah the parak is going to start out. Afterwards, we're going to get to things like which brother and some other things like that. But first, it's going to start out with this psul that we saw at the end of the first Mishnah about Eshet Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. It was case number 14. Okay, here's the case. They're going to describe it before I even try to tell you. We'll describe it in the Mishnah. Ketzad Eshet Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. So what's the situation? Shnei Achim. Okay, there's two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, right? Leah is married to Yaakov. They have Reuven and Shimon. And they're each married to, Reuven's married to Yael. Shimon's married to Shula. Shula's always going to be our tzara. It's going to make it easier. And what happens? Reuven dies, and then nolad lahen ach. Okay, so meit echad mehem. It's always going to be Reuven, the first brother, dies. And after he dies, before Yibum is done, Levi is born. That's the first case. We'll see in the next Mishnah. What if Levi's born later? We'll get to that later. And that's a machlok of Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. There's actually a debate whether Rabbi Shimon argues with this Mishnah as well, but we'll get to all that later. So now, they have a brother who's born later. So remember, Levi wasn't alive at the time that Reuven was alive. So we're going to see that Reuven's wife Yael can't do Yibum with Levi. But what happens if achar kach yibem hasheni et eshet achiv? So Shimon, who was alive at the time, does Yibum with Yael. Now, so yibem hasheni et eshet achiv, right? His brother's wife. Umet. Okay, now Shimon dies. So now Yael falls to Yibum to Levi, and so does Shula, because he's got two wives. And what's the law? The law is yotz'a mishum eshet achiv shelo haya ba'olamo v'ashniya mishum tzarata. This is all basically the explanation of the Mishnah that we already saw, which is, at this point, Yael is exempt because she can never marry anyone who wasn't alive at the time, any brother that wasn't alive at the time that her first husband was alive. So that's Levi. And then she exempts Shula as well. Okay? Hashniya mishum tzarata. Okay, the next one is exempt because she's the tzara. That's the first part of the Mishnah. Now we go to Ma'amar. What is Ma'amar? Okay, it's also on your bookmarks. Ma'amar is some sort of parallel to Kiddushin. The rabbis instituted, we discussed this already. It's like a form of basically Shimon saying to Yael in this case, I plan to marry you, okay? And we talked about it, there's a debate, but we'll see it, whether Yael has to go in willingly to this, right? She has to be part of it, which is what we paskin, that she has to agree to it, which is why Yibum in the end is never really Ba'al Korchan Neged against her will. Because Ma'amar, according to the rabbis, has to happen first. So if Reuven dies, let's go back earlier in the case, Levi is born after Reuven dies, and then Shimon and Yael enter into Ma'amar. So they're basically about to do Yibum. They've decided they're going to do Yibum, and they've done the first step. But on a Torah level, they've done nothing, because on a Torah level, there's no Yibum until they have sexual relations. Yevamot yavo aleha. In this case, there was none of that yet. So on a D'oraita level, this is useless. on a rabbinic level, this is already something. It's like they're already betrothed to each other, as if they're married, because from betrothal, you need yibum already. So now, if Beit Shnia, before they actually get married, Shimon dies. I'm sorry, Umet. I read it wrong. Umet. Shnia, which is the second wife, Shula, choletzet v'lo mityabemet. Okay, clearly Yael is exempt from yibum because she can't because of Levi. Okay, again, this is the rabbi's opinion that Levi, or even we'll see Rabbi Shimon possibly also, but the point is that Yael can never marry Levi because when her first husband was alive, Levi was lo ba'ala olam, and he'll be forever forbidden to her. But Shula is kind of in between. Because on a Torah level, she actually is supposed to do Yibum with Levi. Because on a Torah level, she's the only wife of Shimon. Yael never married Shimon. Yael still has to do Yibum for Reuven on a Torah level. She hasn't done anything with Shimon yet. So therefore, Shula has to do Yibum with Levi. On the other hand, on a rabbinic level, Yael is married to Shimon, which means, or at least betrothed, which is enough to say married for this purpose, which means that she's at Tzarat, Shula is at Tzarat Erva. If Yael can't marry Levi, then Shula can't marry Levi. And therefore, what do we say? Do chalitza. Why chalitza? Because you have to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum on a Torah level, but you can't actually enter into a relationship with him because you're at Tzarat Erva on a rabbinic level. So do the in-between and do chalitza, and that resolves the issue. Okay, that's the mission. Now, Amar Rav Nachman, the first thing we're going to do is just linguistic. We're going to have an issue with the words. Harishona yotza mishum esh tachiv shelo haya ba'olamo. The first one is exempt because of esh tachiv shelo haya ba'olamo, which clearly is referring to the first wife, which in our picture was Yael. But we're going to see that there were different versions of that word in the Mishnah. Amar Rav Nachman, man detane rishona lo mishtabesh, man detane shniya lo mishtabesh. If you say it was rishona there, you're not wrong. If you say the word there was the second one, you're also not wrong. How so? I'm going to turn to Amud Bet now. Man detane rishona lo mishtabesh. My rishona de nefila. That's how we understood it. What does it mean, the first? The first one to fall to Yibum, right? Because there were two Yibums here. One was Yibum for Reuven, one was Yibum for Shimon. There was only one who fell from Reuven, and she was the one who fell first. That was the first wife. So obviously we're talking about her. Uman detane shniya lo mishtabesh. Why? Shniya sounds like the second wife, which sounds like Shula, but it's not Shula. Shula's not exempt. So what do they say? My shniya lenisuin. It means she was the one who married Shimon second. Okay, right? Remember our story. Let's go back to our story for a minute. So first let's go back to the very beginning. Reuben was married to Yael and Shimon was married to Shula. Then when Reuben died and Levi was born, then Yael did Yibum with Shimon. So she was the second wife of Shimon. Okay, that sounds reasonable. But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Milo askina and dibem v'acharkach kines. Says, what do you mean? It doesn't matter what order, right? The picture I showed you, Shula was married already. But theoretically, the case would be exactly the same law if Shimon did Yibum with Yael and then later married Shula. As long as he was married to both women before he died, it doesn't make a difference, the order. So therefore, to call her second, the second one to marry Shimon, that's not necessarily a detail that needs to be. So therefore, it doesn't make sense they would call her second and meaning second one to marry Shimon, because that's an irrelevant point. So elamai shniya benisuin, it means the one who was married twice. Who was the one who was married twice here? Yael, okay, because she was married to Shimon, and then she did ma'amar, she was married to Reuven, then she did ma'amar with Shimon. So that's why it calls her second. This is purely linguistic. Everyone agrees that obviously the only one who's exempt, right, as we saw in the presentation, the only one who's exempt is Yael here, right? That's clear, okay? But the question is only, do we call her first or do we call her second? Okay, next. Now we want to know, what's the source for this? Okay, where do we get it from? We actually saw this a little bit before, but now we're going to see it more. The Yibum pasuk says, when brothers sit together, what does that mean? They have to be alive at the same time. Has to be that they were able to sit together. Reuven obviously never sat in a room with Levi because Levi was born after Reuven was alive. So therefore, this comes to exempt a brother that was not alive at the time the brother died. Yachdav, since they're mentioning this pasuk, there's another drasha from the word yachdav. Miyuchadim benachala. Yachdav means people who are together, not just as they lived at the same time, but it's specifically brothers who inherit together. What does that mean? When a father dies, who inherits? His sons inherit. They split up the nachala. So it's brothers who would split up the nachala together. This would exclude, by the way, uncles. Uncles, in a case, okay, you have to understand, laws of inheritance always go by the father. If the father has no sons, right? So this was benot tzlavcha. They say, we're daughters, we want to inherit. And in that case, they can. Let's say he has no children at all. So where does it go? It goes to his brother. So you might say, well, then the uncle should be able to yibum, but no, because we're talking about only brothers who inherit together. You'll never have a case of an uncle and a brother inheriting together because the inheritance, again, this is by law, not if, someone wrote a will and overrode that. That's a whole different story. But by law, by default, you could say, the brothers will always inherit together. The uncle will only inherit if there are no brothers. So therefore, they say, prat lachiv min ha'em. This comes to exclude what? Brothers from the mother. Okay, if we share the same mother but not the same father, we're brothers, then there's no yibum. We don't do yibum. We've seen this before in a bunch of the cases, right? Yibum is only through the father. We learn it. Now we see where we learn it from. We learn it from the word yachtav. Now, why is there a connection between yibum and inheritance? Because one of the laws of yibum is that the brother not only marries the wife and his obligation is la'akim et shem hamet, he also inherits anything that was the brother's. So all of the brother's inheritance goes to the brother who does yibum. There's big incentive, you could see, financial incentive for the brother to inherit, right? To do yibum because he inherits the brother's property, okay, which is a big deal. Now it makes sense also because he's taking on his wife and he has to provide for her. It makes sense he's getting his brother's wealth to basically help support the wife. But anyway, you could see why they connect them. Rabba Amal, Rabba is going to bring a different proof for this halacha. Eventually, the Gemara is going to say why we actually need both. Amal achim min ha'av yalif, from a different place. We learn fathers, it's through the father, brothers through the father. Achva mi b'nei Yaakov. We learn it from Gzera Shava by the sons of Yaakov. When they go to Yosef, what do they say when they first get to Egypt? Anashim achim anachnu, we're brothers. Now they're all brothers through the father. So here it says achim, and there it says achim. So malahala min ha'av v'lo min ha'em. They don't all share the same mother. Avkam min ha'av v'lo min ha'em. So now the Gemara starts to ask some questions on this. Wait a minute. If you're going to learn it from brothers, where it appears in the Torah, there's other places where brothers appear in the Torah where it's even from the mother. Where? Okay, look at Rashi. Rashi says, a few lines higher in Rashi, Ervat eshet achicha, the wife of your brother, you can never marry. That doesn't matter, brother from the mother or brother from the father. Either one, you can't marry. If you just share the same mother, you can't marry his wife either. So why don't you learn it from there? To which the Gemara answers, we're going to learn the word achim from the word achim, and we're not going to learn which appears by Yosef, the sons of Yaakov, but we're not going to learn achim from achicha. That's already a different word. To which the Gemara says, what's the difference if it's achim or achecha? I'll show you a Gzera Shava. By the way, this structure happens a lot where they bring exactly this kind of thing where we have a Gzera Shava and then they say, why don't you learn it from that word? And they say that word has a bit of a different, it's a different version of the same word, right? It has the same root, but it's worded differently, so we don't learn it. To which they're going to always bring this case from Mitzorah because it's the most extreme case of a Gzera Shava where the words are totally different and yet we learn a Gzera Shava. Ha-tana debe Rabbi Yishmael v'shav ha-kohen u'ba ha-kohen, zoe shiva, zoe biyah. This is in Mitzorah of the house. And it says, the kohen comes back, and then it says, and the kohen comes. These are at different points of the 7 days. If you remember, there's the 7 days and 7 days and whatever. I'm not going to go into all the details. But they learn that certain things, since it gave certain details in one, it didn't give the details in the other. What's true for one is true for the other. From this Gzera Shava, v'shav v'ba. Those are two different words, right? The Kohen part is the same, but Kohen appears thousands, hundreds of times in the Torah, but it's Shava Kohen, Uba Kohen. They say it seems to be comparable. We're going to learn one from the other. So so of course you can learn Achim from Achecha, right? It seems like for sure. So they say, no. And this is always the answer they give when they ask this question. You can learn b'shavu ba because shava kohen uba kohen because there is no other word to compare it to. But in our case, it's a question of achim from achim or achim from achicha. If you're going to have that choice, right? So here, let's read it inside, right? That's where leika demidi didamila. There is no other word that's similar to it. Aval hecha deika midi didamila. But when there's a word that's similar to it, mididamila yafina, we're clearly going to learn it from the word that's more similar. So that's where we're going to learn it from achim. Now they suggest another one. Okay, so now we're insistent we're going to have to learn it from Achim. But wait, we have another Achim pasuk, which is not necessarily brothers from the father, which is actually an uncle case. Remember, he says, but we're brothers, right? Now, he's not a brother. He's the nephew. Okay, so mistabra. So why don't we learn it from there? That maybe you could do yibum with your uncle. Mistabra, right? The woman could do it with her husband's uncle. Mistabra mibnei Yaakov havalei mishum demufnei. The word achim used by the brothers is really unnecessary. Why? And again, once it's unnecessary, that makes it first option for Gzera Shava. Midahavalei lemichtav shnei masar avadecha b'nei avinu. It's actually illustrating, so quoting a different verse there, not the one that we were darshaning before about Kishnem Asar Achim Anachnu. Here there's a verse that says, we're Shnem Asar Avadecha. I don't remember exactly how it goes, but Achim B'nei Avinu, something like that. We're Shnem Asar Achim, we're Avadecha B'nei Avinu. We're the sons of our father. Once we say we're the sons of our father, we're obviously brothers. You don't need Achim in that pasuk, so that Achim is unnecessary. So therefore, it must be we darshan from there. Now we're going to go back. We're going to say, why do we have two answers? One is from Yachdav. We're going to learn it that goes by the father, right? We've gotten totally off track, by the way. This is all because we started with this verse of Ki yeshvu achim Yachdav about the achiv shelo ba la'olam. From there, we wanted to darshan this word Yachdav in another way to say it's through the father. So now we have Yachdav and we have the achim. Why do we need both? Itzrich lemichtav achim ve'itzrich lemichtav Yachdav. Why? You could have learned it from Lot. No, didn't we just say a minute ago? We learned it from Yaakov because it's extra, that word there, and it's not extra in Lot. Well, even in Lot, it's unnecessary. Why? Sometimes lafnuye doesn't mean that the word is extra. It's that the word could have been a simpler word or a less clear. It could have just said, we're friends. That's really what he's saying, right? In Israel, you always say, Achi is my buddy, right? He could have just said, we're friends. Why do you say Achim? That means it's unnecessary. Maybe you could have learned it from there. That's why you need Yachdav to teach you, no, it's only through the father. And only people who inherit together. And therefore, Katav Rachmana Yachdav. Hamiyuchadim benachala. Only people who are together when they inherit together. The Katav Rachmana Yachdav. Well, now we have to see, why didn't you just have that one? You might have thought you need to share the same mother and father. Okay. In other words, maybe it's only mother and father, that you have to be full brothers and not just half brothers through the father. So therefore, you had to say that. So now they say, why would you have thought that? Why would you have thought, if we're learning it from Nachala, what did you need Achim to say? Achim was to say, even if you don't share the same mother, right? Yachdav is to say, is right from the father. And you might have thought also from the mother, comes Achim to say, oh no, look at the sons of Yaakov. They weren't related through their mother. You don't need the mother also. But the Gemara says, so why would you have even thought that? If you're learning it from Nachala, who inherits? Brothers from the father. It doesn't matter. They don't have to be related through the mother. So here's a very interesting line. They say, Itzrich, sal kadat achamina ho'il v'chidushu, de kamishtare erva gabe, ema adam yachte ba'abu v'ima tzrich. The whole thing of Yibum is a crazy situation. That's basically what they're saying. Okay, Chidushu means it's something very unique because we're overriding Isra ever. You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife ever, even when she dies, or even when your brother dies. Sorry, even when your brother dies. Obviously, if she dies, you can't marry her. But even if your brother dies, you can't marry his wife ever, unless it's Yibum. So that's a serious error. And yet the Torah says we're overriding it. Because of that, you might have thought that maybe we're going to limit it. And it's only if you share mother and father. We're full brothers, right? Not only through the father, also through the mother. That's why we have Achim Anachnu from Yaakov to teach you the Gzera Shava of Achim. No, they don't have to be related through the mother. So that was an explanation why we had these two answers, and we actually need them both to fully learn the halacha. Okay, now we're moving on to a very interesting topic, which is Zika. We've talked a little bit about this before, which is how connected is the potential, which is called the Shomeret Yabam. She's supposed to do Yibum with the brother. How connected is she to the brother who's supposed to do Yibum with her? And we'll see in a minute, does it matter if there's two brothers or one brother, right? If there have to be two brothers, but I mean, after he dies, are there two potential Yibum people, or is there only one brother to do Yibum with? You might think that you're more connected if there's only one brother, because it's obvious you're going to do Yibum with him. Whereas if there's two brothers, maybe less. We don't know. This is a big question. Big question. We're going to see a big machloket here. Is there Zika? Is there not Zika? Now, Zika, we're going to see it later in the Gemara. They're going to say Zika. If you say there's Zika, that means Zika knusa dami. It's as if you married her, okay? Because you're so much supposed to marry her that it's as if you were married. Now, what would be the ramifications? So that's going to be our case right now. Okay, comes Rav Huna and he says, Shomeret yabam shemeta mutar be'ima. Someone, okay, Leah has a daughter, Yael. Yael marries Reuven. Okay, Reuven has a brother, Shimon. Reuven dies. Yael falls to Yibum to Shimon. Rav Huna comes and says, if Yael were to die before anything happened between her and Shimon, mutar be'ima. Shimon can marry her mother because he was never related to Yael. Okay, other than the fact that he was his sister-in-law, but that's not an araya. Now, the Gemara says to this, okay, so he's permitted to marry Leah. So the Gemara says, if this is what you're saying, Alma Kasavar Ein Zika. You're obviously saying there's no Zika, because if there was Zika, it would be as if they were married, which means once he's married to the woman, he can't marry her mother because, now, even though he wasn't really married, if you hold by Zika, you would hold that basically he's forbidden to anyone who, right, if you can't marry a woman and her mother, you can't marry a woman and her sister, right? So it would be forbidden. So now they say, if you basically are saying Ein Zika, then why did you give us this weird case? Why didn't you just say, Lema halacha k'divreha omer Ein Zika? Why didn't you just say, Rav Huna would say in the name of Rav, I hold that there's no Zika. That would have been a better way. Then we know a general halacha rather than telling us a very specific, unique case. So they say, well, if you just said Ein Zika, you might have thought Ein Zika when there's two other brothers, there's Shimon and Levi. Because of that, she's not so connected. But maybe if there's only one brother, like our case that we just described, Yesh Zika. So then they say, you could have just specified that. You could have said Ein Zika, even, right, when there's more than one, right? I'm sorry, even when there's only one, there's no Zika. You could have just said that very explicitly. In other words, again, why are you telling us in a case and not just saying outright what you mean? So they say, well, you might have thought Ein Zika means that you can marry her mother even if she's still alive. What was our case? She died, then you can marry the mother. He holds there's no Zika, but he still doesn't allow you to marry the mother if she's still alive. And that's why if I had said Ein Zika, you might have thought that then he can marry the mother no matter what. And this case was to tell you only if she dies, then Shimon's allowed to marry the mother. But if she's still alive, he can't. Why not? Okay, so now, Mechayim lo, right? So Kamash malan de la'achar mita'in, Mechayim lo, only after she dies, not when she's still alive. So let's go back for a minute. Let's assume Shimon's supposed to do Yibum with Yael. And then instead of doing that, he decides to marry Leah. What's the problem with doing that? It's not erva really, but what's the problem? Mishum da'asur levatel mitzvah yivamim. He's basically not, once he marries Leah, he can't marry Yael. So he's basically ruining the possibility of doing Yibum. So that's the problem. So now they bring a Mishnah, which is going to create a problem also. Tnan. So now they say, let's just go back here. Okay, Tnan. Yivimto shemeta mutar ba'achoto. Okay, if this is the exact same case, except we're talking about sisters now. You're not allowed to marry a sister, but, right, if you were married to the sister. So if Reuven was married to Yael, Reuven dies, Yael dies. So Yael's supposed to do Yibum with Shimon. So again, it's telling you he can marry her sister because he was never married to her, right? So now, ba'achota'in bi'imalo. It sounds like he can marry her sister. Now, why would he be able to marry her sister and not her mother? Sounds like just the sister, because we always learned that not only, right, in Zika, but also even if he was married to the sister, once the sister's dead, he actually is allowed to marry the sister. But it sounds like bi'ima lo. So then the Gemara says, no. Hu adin da'afilu bi'ima. It means also her mother, which wouldn't reject Rav Huna. It's because the context there was about the sister. And therefore, they then talked only about the sister, but it would be applicable to the mother as well. It's not an inference that we need to make. Okay, let's finish with Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda Amar, Shomeret yabam shemeta asur bi'ima. He gives the exact same halacha, but says the opposite. You can't marry the mother. Why? Because yesh zika. It's as if Shimon was married to the daughter, in which case, even though they didn't do Yibum and the daughter's dead, still you can't marry her mother. Okay. The mother thing is even after you're dead. Okay. You can't marry a woman and her mother, even if the woman died, as opposed to sisters where it would be. So anyway, the Gemara says the exact same thing. Alma kasavar yesh zika. Why don't you just say there's zika instead of saying this weird case? So lema halacha kidvrei omer yesh zika. Why don't you just say that? Again, we're going to have the same thing, but this is the mirror of the previous sugya. If I would say that, you would have thought, then maybe that's only in the case where there's one brother. But if there's two brothers, maybe there isn't zika. V'haki pligi, betray pligi. So then they say, no, but wait a minute. But this whole machloket is with two. Okay, we'll get back to this line tomorrow. We'll pick up from there. Okay, so we have the similar structure where they each said a unique halacha, each saying opposite things. Basically, the underlying thing is yesh zika or ein zika, depending on who you are. Question, why didn't you just say that, right? And maybe you would get confused between 1 and 2 and think that we were distinguishing, right? Or then they give some other answer. Okay, finished with that for today. I hope this was a little bit clearer in terms of the Yibum cases. I hope that slowly, right, these things are starting to become more clear, because here we're going more in depth and not seeing a million different cases, but more in depth into, a few things rather than being in, 10, 15 different cases like the first mission. Have a great day, everyone.